Before I begin today's video, I just want to mention that I'm launching another channel tomorrow, which is called Lucy Letby Analysis Clips. I noticed that other big YouTubers have these channels in which they post shorter versions of their videos and sometimes do some original content. And I've often been asked to make shorter videos that are easy for people learning about the case to watch, or just content that's more digestible. But it's difficult to combine that with longer form content because it doesn't work well on YouTube. So eventually it's sunk in that I should create another channel and then use this for clips. So I will create some original content, and I'll also have clips of stuff that is particularly illustrative that people may have forgotten or may wish to view again. So the first goal with this channel is to reach 1,000 subscribers. So if you could help me by subscribing and watching, reposting the videos, that would be very much appreciated. The aim of this is to make things go as viral as we can. Having more specific content will make it easier for me to craft impactful titles. It can be very difficult to do that with a longer recording. I always want to be honest about the content of a video, and I don't like to be too clickbaity. And of course, for me, it's morally wrong with this to be too sensationalist, but with more specific content, it's possible to create impactful titles as well. So what I will be doing with this channel is releasing my videos at 4 p.m. UK time. So the first video on this channel, Lucy Letby Analysis Clips, will drop on Friday the 7th of November at 4 p.m. I'll probably do them on alternate days for a while, but I'll just have to suss out what's going to work. And the aim of this channel is to post content it will all be less than 20 minutes. There may be some videos that are less than 10 minutes. And it's just going to be videos that focus on a particular topic. I hope you can help me by supporting this. I will leave the channel link in the description, and I'll pin a comment. And let's try and make it as big as this channel. The first step towards that is to get to 1,000 subscribers. So if you could help me by subscribing and watch the videos when they come out, it would be, and comment, do everything that you've done so much, that's so much appreciated with this channel, then again that would be appreciated once more, and hopefully we can attract some more people to take an interest in this case. In this video we're going to be examining comments made by prosecuting barrister Nick Johnson during his closing statement of the trial of Lucy Letby, particularly regarding child E and certain issues related to bleeding. Now, we've already begun looking at this closing statement in the two videos that are on the screen now, and even at the end of this video we'll only be 10% of the way through this closing statement. Such is the war and peace nature of this court case. In fact, War and Peace doesn't even cover it, because War and Peace is 600,000 words, whereas this goes on for tens of millions of words. The jury were being asked to assess something that is like 20, 30, 40 copies of War and Peace being piled on top of one another. With that being said, let's go into the statement itself. So Nick Johnson begins by saying the following. If you look at the 2200 hours column, so 10 p.m. in the evening, so it's in the bottom right hand corner there, you'll see that Lucy Letby has written 15 millilitres fresh blood. I say she wrote it because Lucy Letby accepted in evidence that it's her writing, but we suggest that she had manipulated circumstances so that this was an entry that was signed by Belinda Simcock, or Belinda Williamson as she's now known. And the point of that, and this is where the other cases become relevant, isn't it? The point of doing that is to dissociate herself from this event if anyone ever goes back to look at the paperwork. So the first thing that I'll say about this is that this is a complete fabrication from the prosecution. There is no actual evidence for what they're asserting here whatsoever. None. Indeed, in every single instance in the court case in which they accuse Lucy Letby of altering records, there is no evidence at any stage that anything they're saying has any foundation whatsoever. This continues throughout the trial. So in the trial we see this exchange between Nick Johnson and Lucy Letby. And Nick Johnson says, there are times when you've been on the neonatal unit when there is no trace of you having been there. And Lucy says, there would be a trace because I would have to swipe, there's no other way. Lucy Letby says it would not be unusual for her to still be on the unit a couple of hours after her shift ended. And then we see this extraordinary comment from Mr. Johnson where he says swipe data doesn't always show when she was there. He points out that colleagues could have held doors open for her. That's a fairly remarkable claim from Johnson, considering that all the way through the rest of the trial, on countless occasions indeed, they cite the swipe card record as being completely reliable. They say Lucy Letby was here in this place at this time. We know of that because of the swipe data. And they completely discount the notion that someone could have held the doors open for her and she could have followed them in without swiping. Of course, what he's saying here in this statement to Lucy Letby is completely true. It's absolutely true that someone could have held the doors open for her. But that, of course, applies to all of the swipe card data and all of the movements of people around the unit at any time during the court case. So essentially, he's ruling out the prosecution case by his own statement. But we see this throughout the court case and the trial of Lucy Letby, is that the prosecution will cite items of evidence and items of the record of the time, and if it supports their case, they will say, right, this is sacrosanct, this is 100% accurate. And then they will take the same piece of evidence, and if it doesn't support the case, they'll just say, oh, it's unreliable. This must have been made up, this must have been altered in some way, or in this case we say, oh yeah, the swipe data doesn't say anything meaningful. Even though on dozens, if not hundreds of other occasions, probably hundreds, if not maybe possibly even over 1,000 occasions in the court case, they're citing swipe data as being legitimate, but here they concede essentially it's not legitimate. And that's exactly what we're seeing with the fabrication of evidence here of Lucy altered the Datex information at other times during the court case because it supports what the prosecution want to say. The prosecution will say, oh, look at the Datex record. We know what happened here. But here, because it doesn't support what they want to say, they have to say, oh, Lucy changed it. We don't have any evidence for that whatsoever, but we'll just say that Lucy changed it. It's a complete fabrication. It's an absolute fabrication. There's no foundation for this whatsoever, just as this comment regarding the swipe cards, there's no foundation for. This comment that he makes here is perfectly reasonable, but of course they don't have any evidence for that. We don't know if she followed someone else in. We have no idea. So I'll return to the closing statement of Nick Johnson. So just as in other cases, even if she wrote data and didn't sign, or got someone else to write things in at a time she was doing things, and when on the 24th of May this year she was asked about that apparent anomaly, she said of that entry, 15 millilitres of fresh blood, I assume it came after Belinda's documentation. That was the evidence she gave. So she got Belinda to sign an entry and then adds to it. You'll remember this in the context, won't you? Do you remember HS, the child in a different nursery, when baby I collapsed for the final time on the 22nd, midnight on the 22nd and 23rd of October? HS, the child who was going to Stoke, after, in that case, Christopher Booth had signed the infusion timed at 2300 hours. So there's a few things to mention here. I will just reiterate once again, there is absolutely no evidence for this whatsoever. That's the first thing to say. The second thing to say about this is that this is context about events that occurred several years ago. So the prosecution is blowing all these things up to be some big deal, when in reality we're looking at often rather trivial details of something that no one can possibly be expected to remember, let alone can they be documented 100%. And if we are going to document them, then we surely have to rely on the actual written record. What the prosecution is attempting to do here is say that the written record has no merit. But as I mentioned previously, on other occasions they will say, oh look, there's a written record, it does have merit because this is what we want to say in court. And then the third thing that I'll say about this is that it all passed very quickly if you look at the actual proceedings of the court case. So we're going to look at this passage here that's highlighted. And what Nick Johnson is accusing Lucy Letby of is altering a timing by an hour, essentially. So it's stated here, child I collapsed at 11:57 p.m. Lucy Letby denies falsifying a note for the Stoke transfer baby prior to that 11 p.m. The court has shown a nursing note by Ashley Hudson, which the court heard was timed at 10:57 p.m. Long line removed due to constant occlusions, neonatal nurse Lucy Letby unable to flush, so Peds Reg Rachel Chang informed. Dr. Chan had written for the Stoke transfer baby at 10 p.m. The baby was safe for transfer. Letby's note for this baby was written at 10:50 p.m. and completed at 10:52 p.m. It included a documentation of a long line infusion with a 10% dextrose fluid. Letby has co-signed the document. Mr. Johnson says the original 2300 reading has been changed to 2400 by Letby. Letby says the 2300 reading was an error and it was changed to 2400 as the correct time. She adds the charts are there for everybody to look at. So there are several things to note here. Firstly, the assertions of Johnson are certainly not proven. Secondly, this is co-signed by someone else. And then thirdly, the written record actually backs up what Lucy Letby is saying. So when he makes these assertions in the court case, he's now associating here something that he has fabricated in the case of child E with something that he has previously fabricated in relation to a child that's nothing to do with the indictment whatsoever. So I want to be clear on that, the level of deception that is part of this closing statement. But we'll continue. This is where you put all the little bits and pieces together, ladies and gentlemen. It's utterly obvious, isn't it, what's going on here? What Lucy Letby did here was sabotage baby E after Belinda Williamson had written her entry. So I don't know if I'd quite describe this as utterly obvious, Nick, but we're going to go over the panel report for child E in a second. I firstly want to talk about the court briefly in the UK. So I have someone commenting regularly who's involved in the legal system in Australia, whose comments are always very much appreciated. And he or she often reflects on how bad the system is in Britain. And it is simply impossible to disagree when you see this court case. I find it incredible that such obvious nonsense is allowed in the court case on such an enormous scale without any objection, and this is treated as evidence. It's mind-boggling, frankly. So here is what the panel had to say about child E or baby 5. This infant was at high risk because he was preterm, had twin-to-twin transfusion with oligohydramnios, and his antenatal ultrasound showed reversed end diastolic flow and dilated small bowel loops. This meant blood was being sucked out of the fetus at the end of each cardiac cycle, and the intestines were likely damaged before birth. The 2 episodes of massive gastrointestinal hemorrhage were most likely due to in utero hypoxia causing stomach or small intestinal ulceration, an erosion into an intestinal blood vessel, or to a vascular abnormality like de la Foy's lesion, which can cause life-threatening hemorrhage. A 25% blood volume loss was likely an underestimate because more was likely lost in the intestines. So they continue to go on to talk about the blood loss, the shock, the fact that this is clearly not a case of air embolism, and that what Dr. Evans has put in the court case is complete crap. Then there's the conclusions. Child E died from massive gastrointestinal hemorrhage due to either intrauterine hypoxia causing stomach or intestinal ulceration or a congenital vascular lesion. Emergency blood transfusion should have been given much earlier. There was no evidence of air embolism. Post-mortem should have been requested. So this is an infant that lost at least 25% of, it's a he, is it not, I believe? Yes. So child E is a he. So he had lost 25% of his blood, but the panel suggests it's probably more. It's very obvious that this was an enormous gastrointestinal bleed, and the panel provides the context in which this occurred. This child should have been given a blood transfusion, and this child should definitely have been granted a post-mortem. Neither of those things happened, which is indicative of yet more major errors on this unit. And what we're going to go through, we've already discussed child E in the previous video in this series, but in the remainder of this video we're going to go through the surreal explanation that the prosecution has provided in the closing statement for this infant. So we'll return to the comments of Nick Johnson. And he continues, she, meaning Lucy, puts it in under Belinda Williamson's initials so that it looks like Belinda Williamson is involved as well. So again, this is just absolute fabrication. There's no evidence for this. Obviously, it's simply far more likely that Belinda Williamson has initialed this because they're supposed to be co-signed. So what could possibly be wrong about this? There's somebody else there when this happens when you look at the notes. Although Dr. Harkness was persuaded in cross-examination that his note at 22:10 hours was really for events from about 21:30, you may think that the note there, timed at 2200, makes that concession dubious to say the least. So I'm going to show you what happened in the trial in reference to what Nick Johnson has just said here, and we can decide whether or not it's reasonable to describe this as a concession. So this is the court reporting of the incident that Nick Johnson has just described. 2:25 p.m, Dr. David Harkness records readings from 9:40 p.m, written at 10:10 p.m, asked to see patient re-gastric bleed, large, very slightly bile-stained aspirate, 30 mins ago. 10 millilitres of blood vomit is also recorded. Letby records at 10 p.m, large vomit of fresh blood, 40 millilitres fresh blood, aspirate obtained from NG tube. Registrar Harkness attended. Blood gas satisfactory. Childie was handling well. Letby's further note, mum visited again approximately 10 p.m, aware that we had obtained blood from his nasogastric tube and was starting treatment. Dr. Harkness noted Childie was alert, pink, well, perfused, with an abdomen which was soft, not distended, and no bowel sounds. The note adds GI, gastrointestinal bleed, ? Cause. So it's interesting as well that the note includes this reference to a gastrointestinal bleed when it's very, very obvious that this is the reason that child E is sadly demised. What we can see in this record is that very clear note-taking from Lucy Letby. Dr. David Harkness is there at the time. Dr. David Harkness doesn't disagree with any of this when he was spoken to in court. He just simply accepted this as being the record of the time. So to say that it was conceded is just spectacularly inaccurate. Dr. David Harkness just agreed with what the written record is. Now, in this case, in this particular instance, the written record doesn't support what Nick Johnson wants to say, so he therefore has to try and discredit the written record and fabricate some ridiculous story around it, which is the fundamental basis for everything pretty much everything we're going to hear in this video. There's also some bad science mixed in there as well, but a lot of it is just trying to discredit what is mentioned at the end here, which is that there's a gastrointestinal bleed, very obviously. So he's trying to downplay that because, he has no scruples or integrity, obviously. It's worth mentioning that in this previous video that I made, what did prosecutors claim about Lucy Letby and Child E? They've already made up times. They've already done that in this closing statement already in relation to this infant. So they've already engaged in fabrication several times and outright lying as well. They're going to outright lie again later in this video. They also made up dates for Child C, so they shifted the dates around according to that. Dr. Evans has made some highly dubious statements about this. And then as well, they fabricate Lucy being around as if this is significant when she's going to be around a lot. And it's based on this discredited chart. But also, just because someone is present, it doesn't mean that they have done something that would represent malfeasance. It just means that they're there. It just means that she was unfortunate to be there when collapses can be recognised, although she's not there for all the collapses. She's not unaccompanied. It doesn't make any sense for approximately 50% of these collapses. You can demonstrate quite easily that she's either not there or it's logistically impossible for her to have done anything untoward to these infants. And yet this chart is used, despite the fact it's been discredited by numerous statisticians. The inferences that are made from this chart that are used in the court case have no merit whatsoever. So there's these four things in relation to this one assertion that I need to mention. So you'll see as this continues that this is some preposterous labyrinthine argument that needs to be constructed to avoid the no pun intended, bleeding obvious that this was a gastrointestinal bleed. So Nick Johnson continues, a reason why Lucy Letby needs Dr. Harkness to be there earlier is that she needs an innocent reason for omitting the feed at 2100 hours. She needs to get the doctor in there earlier as a reason for omitting the feed at 2100, which in turn undermines the mother of baby E and F's evidence. So she's some kind of criminal mastermind, isn't she, really? So if you're looking for why Lucy Letby is doing this, that is the reason. So essentially, this is just simply total rubbish. It's trying to elevate the mother's evidence above the clear physical evidence of what has occurred here, and then also the kind of opinion of medical professionals, including Lucy herself. The mother's timeline doesn't make any sense. It's far more likely, it's basically 1% likely the mother's correct and 99% likely that Lucy is correct. Even if you just look at the basics of what is asserted that I did in the second part of this series. But then on top of that, Lucy is less emotionally involved. Lucy is more experienced. Lucy has better knowledge and has been in contact with many more infants. Lucy is also corroborated by doctors on the unit, and so on. The only reason that Nick Johnson has invented all this crap is because he has to buttress this, as I say, labyrinthine story that makes no sense and is not even tenable, rather than this death can simply be attributed to the prosaic reality that the baby is bleeding to death, that has been cited by the panel, that's now been cited in this medical note. So I'll move on to the next paragraph. She was caught sabotaging baby E by the mother. So this is the second time that he's outright lied in this closing statement. I'll just briefly show you the earlier time when he also lied during this closing statement. We're only 10%, we're not even 10% into it yet. We'll be 10% into it by the end of this section. So we'll find out as we go through the whole thing how many times he's willing to tell outright lies. But this is an outright lie. So this was the first occasion when Nick Johnson lied in this closing statement, where he, similar claim, the mother of baby E and F caught Lucy Letby red-handed. Of course, that's completely untrue because it's agreed evidence that Lucy Letby was never seen doing anything untoward. If Lucy Letby had been seen doing something untoward and this had been corroborated, I would not be sitting here now defending her. You could throw the key away on her as far as I'm concerned. It's uncontested evidence. Even the person that agrees most virulently with the idea that Lucy Letby is guilty has to concede and must agree that she's never been seen doing anything wrong, because that's simply a fact. It's an undeniable fact. So for the prosecution to say twice in quick succession that Lucy Letby was caught doing something wrong, this is the first occasion and we've just seen the second occasion, I cannot understand how Judge Goss doesn't step in and prevent that, because it's not something that should be allowed, obviously. So we'll just return to the comments. So Lucy was, according to Johnson, caught sabotaging baby E by the mother, and this is what she does. This is what she did, we suggest, to cover herself. So now he's saying, we suggest, when previously he said, it's obvious this is what happened, but now it's we suggest, because this is an absolute concoction. This is something that it has less substance than candy floss. It has no substance at all. It's just all fabrication and misrepresentation, and with a few lies thrown in. So then he says, when he arrived at 22:10 hours, Dr. Harkness was told by Lucy Letby that 30 minutes earlier there had been a dirty aspirate. If he was there at 22:30 hours, then you can see why Lucy Letby is so keen to put the aspirate at 2100 hours, which is when the mother of baby E and F is there. So it's important to remember at this point that Harkness has not disputed Lucy Letby's version of events. Elsewhere we will see the prosecution cite the views of Harkness as sacrosanct. Indeed, Harkness appears 23 times in this closing statement. This is exactly like the swipe card data, where if something supports the prosecution case, then it's wonderful and infallible, and if there's something doesn't support it, then Johnson simply makes something up. Presumably he does this all the time in court cases. I don't know, it's very hard to say. You can see how all the bits fit together, can't you? Johnson continues. We then have the sudden large blood-stained vomit and a 14 milliliter aspirate, apparently. So not 15, a 14 milliliter aspirate, which had been taken at about 2200 hours. That's what caused Dr. Harkness to suspect there was some sort of gastrointestinal bleed, but when he examined baby E, all the signs were good. So there very clearly is a gastrointestinal bleed in this case. And it's important to remember, let me just remind you in case you've forgotten, because it'd be very easy to forget this, there's also supposed to be an air embolus in this case. Clearly, air embolus is nothing to do with what occurred in this case. Even the prosecution doesn't really think that it is, because they barely mention it. Because they know, come on, this child's lost 25% of his blood. What the hell does air have to do with it? I don't think you could convince a primary school child. If you explained to, a relatively bright 10-year-old, this child has lost at least 25% of his blood and probably more. Do you think this child died because of air in its stomach or air that's been injected via a syringe? I think there's a certain proportion of 10-year-olds that will be able to say, well, no, it died because of a loss of blood. So that's why you don't see the prosecution mention the fact that their star witness, their lead witness, the person who 95% of the case rests on, who comes up with all of these arcane theories for which there is no support, for which there is no evidence, he wants to believe and he wants to suggest, and it's written in the Court of Appeal document, that this child was partly, the demise of this child was partly due to an air embolism, which is obviously utterly ridiculous. And I think even Nick Johnson knows that it's ridiculous, which is why he's not talking about it. So he continues, his bowels had been opening, his CRP was less than 1, his SATs were good, his other vital signs were good, and it says here in air, that may not be correct, but and on examination, baby E was pink and lively. You'll remember during cross-examination it was suggested to Dr. Harkness that he was out of his depth. So it's very likely that the assertion that Dr. Harkness was out of his depth is accurate, and that's even not necessarily a criticism of Dr. Harkness, because he was put in what is an invidious position where he was in over his head. He was being asked to take on too much and take on too much responsibility in this failing unit. And when we consider the other mistakes on the unit that I'll just go over briefly now, then it's not really particularly controversial to suggest that Dr. Harkness might be out of his depth. Firstly, let me remind you that this infant had a catalogue of health problems, was born particularly vulnerable, and had lost at least 25% of his blood and probably more. Let's look at that first, and then obviously we see here child E died from massive gastrointestinal hemorrhage due to either intrauterine hypoxia causing stomach or intestinal ulceration or a congenital vascular lesion, and there were failures with emergency blood transfusion and no post-mortem being requested. And then if we look at the catalogue of failings on the unit as a whole, it's very clear that this was a unit that was not capable enough to deal with infants of this acuity. They kind of recognise this themselves, but they try to brush under the carpet, and ultimately it's been calamitous for infants that have stayed on the unit, and it's certainly been calamitous for Lucy Letby. So we'll return to Nick Johnson. Do you remember that being put to him? This is Dr. Harkness. Do you remember his reaction? He was insulted by that, Dr. Harkness. So what? So what? Wow, someone hurt a doctor's feelings. Hold the front page. He's a grown man. He's in a responsible position. He's paid well to be in that position. He needs to grow a vertebrae. Is he still crying about this now? There were massive mistakes with this infant. They caused the death of this infant. It's not the first time in this case, and it's not the first time on this unit. The feelings of Dr. Harkness and whether he was upset because someone criticised him are of no relevance. Doctors should not be put on a pedestal in this way. They're just people doing a job. And given the £60 billion figure that has recently been quoted for medical negligence claims, I think it's fair to say that doctors don't always do their job perfectly. So, poor Dr. Harkness, he was insulted. Who cares? Who cares what he felt? I couldn't give a shit. I can tell you that for nothing. Dr. Harkness said that he was discussing things with Dr. C, the consultant who was on site. And when you're considering whether Dr. Harkness was really out of his depth, ladies and gentlemen, you might want to remember what Drs. Breary and J-Ram said about the level playing field. So yeah, let's factor in the views of the two most biased people possible. Probably the two most biased people in the known universe. And then let's ask them what they think. We don't factor in they were saying the possibility that a nurse is actually trying to sabotage children. So what relevance does that have to the fact that there's a massive gastrointestinal bleed and the hospital didn't respond to it adequately, and then they encouraged the parents not to have a post-mortem? What does that have to do with anything? None of these doctors suspected sabotage, did they? Untrue. I mean, that's completely untrue, because you've just asked for the opinion of Breary and Jairam, and we know for a fact that by this time, Breary has been has made quite significant effort to campaign against Lucy Letby on the unit. So although he has been extremely economical with the truth since then, and made a series of disingenuous statements, we know that he suspected sabotage. And I believe, as I've said previously, that initially came from a legitimate place in terms of his beliefs. I don't think Lucy was scapegoated in terms of deliberate targeting. I think they were concerned and they've jumped to a very awry, erroneous conclusion. I think over time it may be evolved into something darker. I don't know. It's very difficult to say. But to say that none of the doctors suspected sabotage is just plainly incorrect and untrue. I don't know if you'd go as far as to say it's a lie. I don't know whether Nick Johnson knows that they definitely suspected sabotage by that point. It's possibly that Breary has misled the prosecution in his statements. He certainly has made misleading statements on numerous occasions. However, regardless of whether the prosecution knows or does not know, it is untrue to say that no one suspected sabotage. So let's continue. They were all looking for a natural cause for what was going on. There was no natural cause because there was no level playing field. So what I would say just basically about that passage is it's just simply drivel. It doesn't require any further consideration or response. So now he says, 2300, Dr. Harkness was called back by Lucy Letby. Baby E desaturated to 70% and there was further blood coming up the nasogastric tube. Baby E was breathing for himself and crying. He had to be given 100% oxygen. But as Dr. Harkness said, and I quote him here, something was interfering with the oxygen getting into his bloodstream. Dr. Kinsey's explanation for the mechanics of air embolus, the blockage caused by the bubble, something was interfering with oxygen getting into his bloodstream. So I'll go over this passage of Dr. Kinsey here. I think actually she's a professor. I think it's Professor Sally Kinsey, in fact, despite what Johnson has said here. So we'll go over what Professor Sally Kinsey said at this point in the court case. So we'll go over here with what occurred with Sally Kinsey in the court case. So the first thing to say is that Sally Kinsey did not appear in the court proceedings for child E, which you can see on the screen now. Sally Kinsey appeared twice. She appeared during the discussion of child F, where she gave a very small amount of evidence for 4 of the infants in the case. And then she appeared even more briefly with regard to child N. So when she was talking about child A, I'll just read this out. Professor Kinsey says, for the conclusion of air embolus for child A, the doctor's descriptions of skin discolorations on the baby had cemented her concerns. She adds it is very rare and has not seen it in her experience, but she says she has read it from literature and the skin discolorations are a stark feature. Professor Kinsey says she is sure the cause of child A's death does not have a hematological origin. So when she's talking about skin discolorations, she's derived these from the doctors in the hospital who were plainly wrong and also clearly don't know what the hell they're talking about. She doesn't know what she's talking about. She's never seen it before previously. She's a haematologist who's giving evidence outside of her personal experience and her specialism, which I appreciate. She knows more about medical matters than me, but you should not be in court as an expert witness giving opinions on things that you know nothing about. They're not your specialism. So it's hardly surprising that she makes a pig's ear of it. And then eventually she comments on child E and child F, and if you actually go through this, you see she doesn't make a single comment about air embolism with regard to child E. So Nick Johnson this shows you how weak the evidence is. He's introducing someone who didn't even give evidence in relation to this child. And then we'll also move on to this, which is Professor Kinsey said, this comment, it was a pretty stark description of what sounded to be an embolus to me. What, can you imagine weaker evidence coming from a haematologist who's just a blood expert, who's nothing to do with this? She's read a bit about it in some medical literature. And so, the doctors have said they saw strange discoloration, so I reckon it's probably an air embolism. And then Dr. Evans has sent me his reports as well. Questioned about the death by Mr. Myers, she agreed that air embolus did not feature in her expertise, and she had drawn parallels between a 1989 medical journal review of the condition and what had been observed by doctors and nurses in the case of child A and child B. And she said in court, basically, I've got no experience in this. I don't really know what I'm talking about. The literature's really weak. And of course, she's mentioning 1989 Medical Journal Review. We know what that is. It's the Lee and Tanswell paper of Professor Hugh Lee, who's just said all of the evidence related to the injection of air in this case is categorically wrong because it's all based on my paper, which is the only diagnostic source, and they've misused it. It's not even about venous air embolism anyway. So that is the quality of evidence that was provided by Professor Sally Kinsey. So now we're going to return to the comments of Mr. Johnson. Dr. Harkness planned to intubate baby E, and whilst that was being organised, there was a further sudden deterioration at 23:40 hours. And in between times, it was Lucy Letby who had been looking after baby E. You will remember what Dr. Harkness described he saw, quote, a strange pattern over the tummy area, over the abdomen, which didn't fit with the poor perfusion. In between the chest, the upper legs, the rest was still pink. But there were these kind of strange purple patches that appeared over the outside of his tummy. Do you remember Dr. Harkness was moving his hand as he was describing that to you? He went on to say there were patches in one area and there were some in the other. Not very clear that, but some of it was still nice and pink, but it was certainly unusual and not fitting with a baby that's completely shut down or poor perfusion. So we'll look at what the panel said about this now. So I'll just switch over to this. So patchy skin discolorations are caused by dilation and contraction of small blood vessels in the skin in response to hypoxia, which can occur in many conditions and are not diagnostic of air embolism. So this is something that I was told by a vascular surgeon, that discoloration is common, mottling is very common in these conditions. It's not specifically characteristic or diagnostic of air embolism at all, as is being stated here. Zhu and Lee reported that non-specific localized patchy skin discolorations have not been reported in infants with venous air embolism, including IV air injection, and that only Lee's sign and Liebermeister's sign are diagnostic of air embolism, as shown in this 2024 paper. If air was deliberately infused through a central venous line to cause air embolism, the line will have to be reinfused with fluid to prevent detection. Collapse from air embolism occurs instantaneously. It is doubtful that this can be achieved quickly enough before other staff in the unit respond to the collapse. So, of course, referencing this paper, Vascular Air Embolism in Neonates, a literature review. So what we can essentially conclude from that is that the previous paragraph and the previous assertions of Nick Johnson can just be thrown out immediately, and they can essentially be ignored and discarded. But we'll move on to the next paragraph from Johnson. You will remember that he was saying in terms that this was not something he had ever seen outside the context of the babies in this case, and he was drawing a comparison with what he had seen with baby A. He said what he had seen were patches that were no smaller than 1 to 2 centimetres. One of the strange or unusual things about what he saw was that it didn't remain constant. He was cross-examined, you'll remember, about differences in his description of what he had seen in baby A's case and what he saw in baby E's case, and he said this. So essentially this is all just junk science. It's not even worth responding to this. I'll just mention a couple of things, though. Not having seen something before doesn't mean anything. That doesn't mean that Dr. Evans' diagnoses are correct because they haven't seen it before. And then secondly, it's acknowledged here by Johnson that under cross-examination, this doctor is stating that the description of what he saw in the case of baby A and baby E are completely different. And we see that throughout the case. They're completely different rashes, but they should be consistent because there's a consistent diagnosis. So as I say, this is all just junk science. It's complete crap. As simple as that. We know that now. It's not open to debate even. So Johnson continues. It was something that was so unusual that it's hard to give a clear description. The point here, ladies and gentlemen, is we have a doctor saying this is something I'd not seen before. The precise way he described it isn't so important, is it? So, I mean, that's a fairly remarkable statement. So there's two possible things you can say about that. Yes, the precise way that he described about it is important. Of course it's important because air embolism, venous air embolism has a very distinct presentation and the observations of the doctor need to be consistent with this. So of course it's important, it's very important. And then the second thing is this doctor doesn't know what he's talking about by his own admission and you've made inferences from this which are plain wrong. So I'll continue. What he was saying was that he was seeing the same thing again, the same thing that he'd seen with baby A, he was seeing with baby E. Hold on a second, Nick. You've just said that he saw completely different things. So which one is it? An interesting feature is that if you go to Lucy Letby's interviews, she describes what she saw in baby A's case as very similar to that of baby E. So that's not relevant. We know this isn't true. We absolutely know it's not true. And then also, as with so many other observations, Lucy Letby is not qualified to give... Of course, she can look at something and say, I saw this, it roughly looked like this. But she doesn't know anything about the clinical presentation of venous air embolism. No one on the unit does, by their own admission. The doctors don't know. So there's no way Lucy's going to know. There's different discoloration across the cases. There's no similarity whatsoever in clinical signs or reasons for collapse between child A and child E, as Nick Johnson is attempting to suggest here. So I'm going to show you the differences between child A and child E now. So there's a comparison table here between baby 1 and baby 5, or child A and child E. So first thing is, gestation and birth weight is different. Child E, semi-elective caesarean section for twin transfusion syndrome with oligohydramnios, whereas this is child E is a younger child. It's a slightly smaller infant. Baby A has an emergency C-section for maternal hypertension. So if Martin Pittman was here now, he would explain all of the significant aspects of this. As you know, I can't do this because I'm not an obstetrician. But it's very clear that they're significantly different. Then we have relevant maternal antenatal background. Antenatal ultrasound dilated small bowel loops and absent reversed end diastolic flow in the case of child E. In the case of child A, mother with antiphospholipid syndrome can predispose to thrombosis, reported gestational cholestasis. Immediate postnatal course before collapse required resuscitation at birth but stabilised compared to being bagged at birth on CPAP. Completely different clinical signs. Sudden, pale, poorly perfused, apneic, desaturated, small ECG complexes. Heart rate fell despite 7 doses of adrenaline. Skin, blotchy patches, brighter pink on bluey-grey background. No blood gases obtained during 30-minute resuscitation. Compared to sudden deterioration after large gastrointestinal bleed, desaturation, poor perfusion, bradycardia, purple patchy discoloration, etc. Objective findings, recent non-occluding thrombus in liver. No post-mortem record in summary. Antenatal imaging showed abnormal gut and reversed end diastolic flow. Chest x-ray was clear. And then the mechanism, thrombosis compared to massive gastrointestinal hemorrhage. And then completely different final conclusions from the panel. So then if you bring over the third column, baby 5 was more... So child E, we'll use the original parlance. Child E was more premature and smaller. Child E had twin-to-twin transfusion syndrome, antenatal fetal compromise. Child A's background raises thrombosis risk. Child E had clear antenatal signs of severe fetal compromise affecting gut and circulation. Child A collapse linked temporally to restarting IV infusions after line changes. Child E had progressive clinical deterioration over days with massive gastrointestinal bleeding before sudden collapse. Both had sudden collapse with poor perfusion and patchy skin discoloration, but child E had preceding massive gastrointestinal hemorrhage and ongoing signs of sepsis, intestinal disease. Child A's collapse followed central line manipulations and restarting fluids. Indeed, this was an infant that had to be intubated multiple times. Child A has a documented thrombus on post-mortem. Child E lacks post-mortem in the summary and has an antenatal bowel vascular abnormalities. Both had allegations of deliberate air injection. Child E additionally alleged inflicted trauma. Child A thromboembolism fits, documented thrombus. Child E catastrophic gastrointestinal blood loss from antenatal gut injury or vascular lesion is favoured. Air embolism not supported in either case by panel. Distinct causes thrombosis versus massive GI hemorrhage. Both panels rejected air embolism. So to Nick Johnson, they may be similar because it's two babies in the hospital and they both got ill. But to a doctor or to anyone looking through the medical notes with any degree of competence, they are not remotely similar. They weren't the same from the moment they were born, throughout the problems they had in the unit, throughout their signs of disintegration and collapse, through the clinical signs that were associated with these collapses, and to the reasons that they died. There are no similarities between these infants whatsoever. So I'll return to the comments of Johnson. You'll remember how traumatised Dr. Harkness was by what he had seen. You'll remember him describing the effect it had on him, how he had to have time off work. He had never seen a baby bleed the way that baby E did. I'm really sorry to hear that, but this is of no relevance whatsoever, apart from the fact that the baby was bleeding profusely, which is the reason the baby died, and it was a gastrointestinal bleed, which is really obvious. But we'll continue on to the next statement. On the other hand, if we go to tile 253, we can see how Lucy Letby felt about it. It's the same day that baby E died. She said, quote, "One of those things. Nothing to see here." That's the message, isn't it, ladies and gentlemen? Nothing to see here. Remember me saying about gaslighting her colleagues, persuading them that the wholly abnormal was in fact normal. So, again, this gaslighting comment, firstly, most of that is fabricated anyway, but also it has no relevance here. But, I mean, this is a particularly despicable comment from Johnson, as I will demonstrate to you now. So Nick Johnson knows very well that Lucy Letby cried in court over the death of child E, which she found very traumatic. You see this Guardian report at the time. Lucy Letby sobs in court. She recalls traumatic death of baby at a hospital, which would be a very natural reaction because she had a close relationship with the parents of child E and child F, and then the infant died in these horrible circumstances, bleeding very heavily. So Nick Johnson knows very well this happened, and yet within days of this occurring in court, he was cross-examining Lucy Letby and accusing her of never crying over any of the infants. Now he's accusing her of not caring about child E and being cold about the death of this infant, which, as I say, I don't think it's unreasonable to describe this as despicable. Whether or not it's outright lying is another matter. It's definitely, there's a fine line between deliberate misrepresentation and outright lying. This could be generously described as deliberate misrepresentation. It's certainly deliberate misrepresentation. Whether it's outright lying or not is open to debate, but he is suggesting something. I do think it's fair to say this is a lie because he knows this is untrue. He knows Lucy Letby was obviously affected by the death of this infant because he's witnessed her crying in court and court proceedings had to be interrupted. So how he could possibly claim Lucy Letby couldn't care less about this child when he's seen her crying, we're not talking about now an eyewitness account or something that was recounted to him through records, through documents. He saw her crying in the court in front of him and he knows it's about this infant. But he's accusing her of not caring about the fact that this infant had died. I don't think it's unreasonable to describe that as lying, but the absolutely most generous interpretation you can make is that it's a deliberate misrepresentation. So Johnson continues, moving away from that text, please. It was suggested to Dr. Harkness that he'd been influenced by discussions he had had with others. He denied it. So to say that he hadn't been influenced when we know that Dr. Breary and Dr. Jairam ran this campaign on the unit that we've examined in previous videos, they were able to, particularly Dr. Brewery is the ringleader, and they were able to influence, and Dr. Brewery was able to influence numerous people on this neonatal unit. So it's not completely inconceivable that Dr. Harkness wasn't influenced, but we know there was a climate in which it was very likely that he could have been influenced. And so this continues. And even Lucy Letby doesn't put him in the gang of four. So, I mean, this is all really now supposition and speculation. But here's something that isn't speculation. So this is from 1:41 p.m. in court when Child E is being discussed. Mr. Myers suggests that a gastrointestinal bleed should have led to a blood transfusion. This is very clear. Dr. Harkness says if there were other observations which collated that, he would have done so, but at this point he would not have done so, as the blood vomit could have had other causes. He said a blood transfusion may have come up in a conversation with a fellow doctor. Mr. Myers asked why that wasn't documented. Dr. Harkness says he cannot answer that. So what we're seeing here are enormous blunders on this unit. So notice that the datex and the notes are always held against Lucy. She's diligently noting things all the time, and this is always held against her. Whereas here, there's a massive gastrointestinal bleed. The infant loses 25% of his blood, and probably more. They discussed the fact there was a gastrointestinal bleed. They apparently may have discussed having a blood transfusion, but they didn't write it down anywhere, and then the infant died because of this gastrointestinal bleed. This is a fairly extraordinary catalogue of mistakes. This is yet another case in which the parents of Child E would have a case against the hospital. So then we return to the comments of Nick Johnson. Was Dr. Harkness a liar? Not a liar, Nick, but he doesn't make any accusations regarding Lucy Letby, and he accepted that your version of events is wrong. You're the person who is a liar. Do you remember the evidence of Dr. C, the consultant, who said that when she arrived at baby E's side at a later stage, Dr. Harkness had told her in quite a lot of detail about some very dark purple patches he had seen on the abdomen and the unusual appearance of these. She said that when Dr. Harkness, had spoken to her, he had told her in quite an animated fashion because it was quite an unusual appearance. All I'll simply say about this is we now know this is irrelevant. So if Dr. Harkness is lying about this, Dr. C is supporting the lies, isn't she? What are the chances of that, ladies and gentlemen? How far does this supposed conspiracy go? So this is just smear tactics, obviously. Do you remember I said what Lucy Letby actually said is quite similar? If you go to baby E, you'll find Lucy Letby describing a patch of purpleness, interesting word purpleness, on baby E's abdomen that was, quote, not something normal for a baby to have. That's what she said. You can check it. So what I would just briefly say to this is, why would Lucy Letby be incriminating herself by saying it's similar to the previous thing if she had deliberately injected air into these infants? I mean, this infant has nothing to do with air. It's quite obvious this infant has died due to the gastrointestinal bleed anyway. Essentially, this is all just drivel. She said it was on his right-hand side, Nick Johnson continues, by the belly button, and she went on 2 pages later to say that she asked for Dr. Harkness to review baby E again after the discoloration. And in evidence on Friday the 5th of May, she said there was, quote, a red sort of horizontal banding across the abdomen just around the area of the umbilicus. So, ladies and gentlemen, if it's true, and Lucy Letby appears to be conceding that it is true, the baby E did have a strange discoloration on his abdomen, why was Dr. Harkness being taken to task for saying it? It is all to create in your minds the impression that in some ways the doctors are bad, that they're all ganging up on Lucy Letby. We invite you to conclude that it was all in effect a gratuitous attack on the integrity of Dr. Harkness. So again, why would Lucy Letby highlight this strange discoloration if she had deliberately attacked the infant with air? That'll be the first question I ask you. And then obviously the rest of it is just this narrative of, oh, it's all a crazy conspiracy and Lucy Letby is a conspiracy theorist. It's just very obvious smear tactics. The other thing that I'd say about this is that the actions of Lucy Letby that are alleged in this case make no sense. Firstly, she is outlining and highlighting issues with the infants that would be later used against her in court. Why would she do that if she knew that she'd deliberately harm the infant? That would be extremely strange behaviour. The reason she's actually highlighting these things is because She's a responsible, conscientious nurse who cares about the well-being of the infants on the unit. That's why, as I've mentioned in previous videos, she fought to have this child. I believe the parent of this child is called Kate Walker, who commented in 2018 at the time that Lucy was named for the first time. Kate Walker commented, she fought to get this my child transferred to a tertiary unit because she was concerned about the infant's well-being. Another sign of a conscientious nurse, of course, there are many others. So why is she highlighting rashes? I mean, the prosecution wants to believe she's an expert on air embolism as well. So wouldn't she have found out that it can result in some sort of odd discoloration, and why would she be highlighting this so much if she deliberately injected air? That's complete nonsense for starters. Secondly, why is Lucy attacking the infant supposedly with a tool, although Dr. Evans just pulled that out of the ether? That's just completely fabricated. There's no evidence for that at all. He just made it up. But why is she allegedly, supposedly, hypothetically doing that when she has already and will again, according to the allegations, successfully attack infants with air alone? Why would she use a tool and cause this gastrointestinal bleeding that's actually obviously naturally occurring? Why would she do that when it creates a really obvious physical sign of the infant deteriorating? There's simply no reason for it. So you see on the screen now, child A air embolus, then child B's air embolus, then she switched to air via nasogastric tube, then back to air embolus, then with child E, she supposedly used a tool to cause acute bleeding as it's described here, but she threw in some air embolus as well. It's very hard to say what. I mean, there's nothing here that's even remotely consistent with her embolus. Then she poisoned an infant with insulin. Then she switched to milk. Then she went back to air via nasogastric tube. Then she went back to insulin. Then she went back to air embolus. Then she threw in a throat trauma. Then she used a tool again in the case of child O that supposedly overlapped with this case and child E. Then she went back to air via nasogastric tube. Preposterous. Utterly preposterous. It feeds into the general theme, Nick Johnson continues, that Lucy Letby is being scapegoated for other people's incompetence and malpractice, which ironically is absolutely true. We know that now. And the point of the attack, we suggest, was to try to persuade you that in some way Dr. Harkness is prepared to make things up which implicate Lucy Letby in the most serious crime. But the problem with the attack is really he was saying in his way what she was saying in her way in her interview. So again, this is just drivel and really requires no response. The reason for this arcane line of argument is that this infant died of a gastrointestinal bleed because they screwed up in the hospital. This was actually established in court. It's now been cited by the panel. If the prosecution was even remotely objective, they would just concede this. At 23:45 hours, baby E was intubated as an emergency. The capnograph told Dr. Harkness that the tube was in the correct place and the discoloration on baby E remained. In cross-examination, it was suggested to Dr. Harkness he should have intubated baby E before that time, and he was accused of incompetence for delaying the blood transfusion, which is correct. He was incompetent. But the truth, ladies and gentlemen, is that it was Lucy Letby harming baby E. And because she was the cause, and because she wasn't letting on what she had done, the doctors were never going to be able to save him. Yeah, they couldn't possibly have done a blood transfusion. That would have been impossible. And then they couldn't have ordered a post-mortem. There's just no way. You will remember that Dr. C arrived at 0:25 hours on the 4th of August, had a discussion with Dr. Harkness at the CoCH side, and then they moved from the CoCH side over to review the x-ray on the computer and to review the blood results. And even if you don't remember it, you know what happens next, don't you? They move away to a computer either at the nurse's station or in nursery 1, and we know it's just around that little wall in nursery 1, and it was at that point that baby E deteriorated for the final time. So again, this is just utter drivel. But if I did make a video about the nurseries, I'm not going to go over showing you that now, but there's such a small space between these nurseries. It's such a compact unit. There's windows constantly overlooking the nurseries. There are people going in and out. What he's saying here is just absolute crap. Logistically, a lot of the things that are asserted, this is yet another thing that's being asserted that is nonsense. And also, he's citing something here as part of this increasingly complex, multifaceted theory. Layer after layer after layer is required, and now he's saying this is some sort of significant event. When of course the infant can deteriorate any time. It really is completely meaningless by linking it to what he is asserting regarding a nurse being at a nurse's station at a computer, which is still overlooking the nursery, and he's just a matter of feet away. So it's just total rubbish. This is just, again, a paragraph that just has no merit and an argument that has no merit whatsoever. And of course, he finished it off by saying, what are the chances of it being precisely at that moment? Of course, this is of no significance at all. This is just another nonsense claim. Baby E collapsed for the final time at about 0:25 hours. CPR was started, drugs administered. Baby E was given a blood transfusion at 00:50 hours, and as CPR was given, blood came from his nose and his mouth, the likes of which Dr. Harkness had never ever seen before. I mean, to be fair, they've never seen anything on this unit. I mean, I'm surprised they've seen a baby before. But after 10 minutes, spontaneous heart rate returned. So, not much more to say about that. Let's just move on to the next paragraph. You've heard that before, haven't you, in several cases, not least, perhaps most dramatically, baby C. So, as I've already mentioned, we've compared child C and child E. There's no similarities between them. It's completely untenable to compare the two. What he's saying here is utterly irrelevant. So then he says, but unhappily, baby E didn't survive. You'll remember that Dr. C advised against having a post-mortem, a decision or advice that she plainly substantially regretted, you may think, when she gave evidence. She should regret it. It was a massive mistake. And she made the point in the witness box that with necrotizing enterocolitis, a child's observations deteriorate over a longer period of time than happened with baby E, and that the normal x-rays that were taken of baby E were not consistent with necrotizing enterocolitis, so this is no longer relevant. No one now, as far as we understand, seriously suggests that baby E did have necrotizing enterocolitis. Dr. C also discounted stomach ulceration on the basis that if a child died from a natural blood loss, she'd have expected to see a more gradual deterioration, not these cliff edge type deteriorations that baby E had. And if it was a gradual blood loss, as you would expect in the case of a stomach ulceration, the heart rate would go up and the blood pressure would go down, and this was not what was happening with baby E. She, like Dr. Harkness, said she'd never seen bleeding like this before in a small baby, and she said that other than baby E's blood glucose, which had normalised in the lead up to the events of this shift, there was nothing in his observations to suggest that he was unwell in the sense of there being a cause for the bleeding and collapse. So essentially they just missed all the signs that have been outlined by the panel, as they did in so many cases because they're an inept, incompetent unit. The expert evidence is a big help, ladies and gentlemen, to you, we suggest, in determining what happened. So let me make something clear. A lot of this is not expert evidence. It's essentially eyewitness accounts being offered by doctors who made mistakes and who lack understanding and who are incentivized, essentially, not to give evidence against themselves. I don't say that they were necessarily covering their own tracks. But of course, they're not going to go into court and say, yeah, it's all my fault. I held my hands up. It's completely my fault this infant died. That's just not going to happen. So to say this is expert evidence is absolutely untrue. Importantly, and in the absence of a post-mortem examination, it excludes the possibility of baby E having died from natural causes. Professor Kinsey excluded the possibility of there having been a congenital bleeding disorder. You'll remember what she said about baby F, I'm sure. The fact that he is baby E's identical twin, the fact that she looked at baby F's blood results and could therefore exclude the possibility of there being a congenital bleeding disorder. So this is all completely irrelevant. Baby E was bleeding from the throat just like baby C, like baby G, and like baby N. Baby C was before baby G, baby N was later. Dr. Arthurs told us that the imaging didn't really help with what happened to baby E, and went on to say that the absence of air in the great vessels didn't make a difference in determining the issue of air embolism because images are not taken in the acute resuscitation period. This doesn't By the way, this isn't supportive of the prosecution, by the way, and therefore you would not expect to see air. He also said that because very few babies die of air embolus, there isn't a great deal of imaging, no imaging records really to compare against. So again, that's not supportive of the prosecution case. And what we see frequently throughout this closing statement, you're going to see it again and again as we continue with this in future videos, is this attempt to link various cases together as if there is a meaningful pattern. There is no meaningful pattern here, and to demonstrate this, I will now compare babies C, G and N from the court case that's just been cited by Nick Johnson. So it's easier to show this in passages rather than in a table. But in terms of gestational age, child C was moderately preterm but severely growth restricted. Child G was extremely preterm and extremely low birth weight. And child N was the least premature but was affected by twin and intrauterine growth restriction issues. In terms of the antenatal perinatal period, child C had abnormal in utero blood flow. Child G had prolonged ruptures of membranes with suspected chorioamnionitis and uncontrolled delivery, indicating infectious and extreme preterm risk. Child N was delivered by emergency C-section to a haemophilia carrier mother, bringing inherited bleeding risk. Child C presented with hypothermia, low blood counts consistent with severe intrauterine growth risk. Child G suffered with severe RDS hyaline membrane disease. Child N had mild RDS but clinically significant moderate haemophilia. Key clinical signs prior to collapse. Child C showed progressive gastrointestinal signs. Child G acutely developed projectile vomiting, large watery stools, purple distended abdomen and desaturation. Child N had transient screaming and escalating respiratory compromise with later mottling, repeated desaturations and oropharyngeal bleeding. So the collapse events are completely different, resuscitation response is completely different, the post-event investigations and findings are completely different, and then ultimately the cause of collapse. In child C, it's acute small bowel obstruction, severe pain, apnea and collapse, worsened by RDS and intrauterine growth restriction, ineffective ventilation. Child G, infective gastroenteritis, probable enterovirus, causing vomiting, ileus, desaturation and apnea. Child N, airway compromised due to haemophilia, related bleeding, spontaneous or minor trauma aggravated by traumatic airway attempts. These represent three distinct pathophysiological mechanisms: mechanical obstruction, infection ileus, and hemorrhagic airway obstruction. Child C died after active resuscitation was stopped. Child G recovered after a week of antibiotics and ventilation, and Child N recovered after specialist airway management. For Child C, the main findings were misrecognition of surgical abdominal signs, inadequate escalation to surgical opinion, delivery in a non-tertiary setting, and prolonged ineffective resuscitation by inexperienced staff. Child G's care showed appropriate recognition of deterioration, escalation and supportive treatment leading to recovery, radiographic gas explained by bagging. Child N highlighted problems with repeated junior intubation attempts causing trauma and a delayed transfer to specialist care, and the need for haemophilia-specific nursing airway protocols. Overall, the critical system themes are recognition, escalation, appropriate skill mix for airway management, and condition-specific protocols. Although all three infants were preterm and critically ill, they differ sharply in etiology, course, and outcome. Child C was a moderately preterm but severely growth-restricted infant whose progressive signs of intestinal obstruction were missed, a contraindicated feed, a prolonged period of ineffective resuscitation, and underlying myocardial ischemic vulnerability culminated in death. Child G, the most premature, had an acute gastrointestinal and respiratory deterioration, best explained by infection, likely enterovirus, and recovered with appropriate respiratory support and antibiotics. Child N, the most mature, had a bleeding diathesis, haemophilia, that led to airway bleeding, repeated traumatic intubation attempts, but ultimately recovered after specialist intervention and factor replacement. Across the three cases, the panels found medical and system explanations for collapse and rejected deliberate harm theories. Recurring themes are the importance of timely surgical infectious coagulopathy, assessment, early senior input for difficult airways, and unit level protocols to match the infant's specific risks. Or, as Nick Johnson put it, they were all the same. So we will now return to the comments of Nick Johnson. Dr. Evans was taken to task for having suggested in one of his early reports that perhaps the nasogastric tube was used to cause an injury to child E. Well, he did literally make this up, so it seems not unreasonable to take him to task. The very thing that the mother of baby E and F says Lucy Letby said to her on the night. Ironically, he said that when he had seen a tube before the trial started, he'd rejected that himself as a theory. So this is just another nonsense argument, just hoping to confuse the jury. But we'll look back at what was said about the tube. So the mother asked Lucy Letby why child E was bleeding and what was wrong. She said Letby replied that the feeding tube was rubbing the back of her throat and that would have caused the blood. So I think if this even happened, what Lucy would have said is it could possibly be that the feeding tube is rubbing the back of her throat. She wouldn't have been so definitive because she wouldn't know for sure. The mum said she accepted that explanation but was concerned about it. The mum said Letby told her to go back to the ward and she did what she was told as Letby was in authority and knew better than me and I trusted her completely. And then at 11:48 we see Mr. Myers says he suggests the mum went with the breast milk as late as 10 p.m, that Lucy Letby never mentioned the tube was irritating child E. The mum disagrees with both of those suggestions. So we've already established that the mother is incorrect about the time. So that doesn't mean automatically that she's incorrect about this recollection regarding the tube rubbing the back of her throat, but it's the kind of thing that a false memory can be created about. And ultimately this is just one person's word against another. As I've said previously, given that Lucy is not as emotionally involved, is more experienced, has dealt with more infants, is a professional, etc., has more medical knowledge, it's more likely that her version is correct. But we can't say for certain. All we can say is this is, again, a hypothetical discussion where we're being asked to just simply accept something because someone says that it's true. In this case, it's someone who previously her version of events in relation to something else is likely to be incorrect. It should be emphasised as well that Dr. Evans dropped the nasogastric tube because he knows that it's wrong. Lucy may or may not have said this. Based on previous evidence, it's likely that she didn't say it. But even if she did say it, it's still not relevant. She was simply incorrect. Dr. Evans has fabricated the method of attack for this infant with no evidence. We know he's fabricated it because the prosecution has conceded here that he changed his mind, not for the first time. So Dr. Evans has said the nasogastric tube that they had in the unit could not cause this bleeding. He has said that. So the fact that Lucy Letby has suggested, possibly, even if that's true, which it probably isn't, that the nasogastric tube might have irritated the throat, firstly, that's something that was considered, but it's also completely irrelevant because it's even accepted by the prosecution witness to be untrue. So we'll go back now to the words of Nick Johnson again. But that didn't stop him being criticised for having raised it in the first place. So we're here. And the important point being made by Dr. Evans was that the bleeding was not the result of some natural or innocent phenomenon. So he should be criticised. He should be criticised for making something up and then putting it in a report that will result in someone being charged and then actually ultimately convicted for something that would result in life in prison. So he should be criticised for just completely fabricating something that's not something that we should be critical of. It's absolutely correct that he was criticised for his ridiculous assertions and some of the ridiculous evidence he gave in court. In answer to questions about stress, Dr. Evans says it doesn't turn up out of the blue on day 5 or 6 of a child's life. So bear in mind that Dr. Evans always discounts everything other than malfeasance. We know that signs of deterioration were missed. We could go back again and look at what I've been over several times already in this video. The clear clinical signs of child E. I mean, we know this child died due to gastrointestinal bleeding. This is all ultimately ludicrous, what is being discussed here. But to say that the child was completely fine, there was no signs of any problems whatsoever, and then it just suddenly collapsed he suddenly collapsed out of nowhere is just rubbish. It's total rubbish. So Nick Johnson continues, and you will remember the evidence of Nurse B, who said that baby E had been out during the day having skin-to-skin contact, and you'll find in the nursing notes with his mum for most of the day before he died. So I'm not really sure of the relevance of this. We know that this infant died of a gastrointestinal bleed anyway. So that is not stressful for a little baby. Dr. Evans referred to the graphic description given by Dr. Harkness of flitting patches of discoloration and told you that in his view that was clear evidence of air in the circulation, and if baby E was caused a bleeding injury or had air in his circulation, we suggest there's only one person that can have been responsible. So that's all completely irrelevant now. So we're just here in the passage. So far as baby E's bleeding was concerned, Dr. Evans thought it had to be the result of trauma and pointed to the fact that neonatal units are full of bits of equipment such as suction tubes or introducers which might have been used, and he was cross-examined at some length about that, and it was suggested that there was no evidential basis for saying that an introducer had been used, which of course is absolutely correct. There is no evidential basis for suggesting that. Well, the evidential basis, ladies and gentlemen, this should be good, is the result of whatever it was that happened that was not a natural event. We say was used, this was no naturally occurring bleed. So, I mean, that is just absolute waffle and complete nonsense. Also, it's categorically incorrect. I mean, this is just absolutely wrong. It's utterly incorrect. So move on to the next statement. Many other children in this case had inexplicable bleeds somewhere in their throats or coming up from their vocal cords. That's a phrase you're now very familiar with in this case. And as I say, the most obvious other case is baby N, baby C, baby G, and one I missed out from my earlier list, I think, baby H as well. So I could show you a comparison of these cases, but I've shown you baby N, baby C, baby G. As baby H was a case Lucy was not found guilty on, I won't make a comparison between the four cases. So please note, I'm using the number 4 here. And let's see what Nick Johnson says next. So you have a list there of 5 children of these 17 where this unusual sign was spotted. So I think you'll find, Nick, that baby C, baby G, baby H and baby N makes 4. So unless you can't count to 5, which I assume you can, I know there's some shaky statistics and shaky mathematics in this court case, but I assume that you can count to 5. So assuming that you can count to 5, this is another deliberate lie. You're just trying to sneak this past the jury quickly and say it's 5 out of the 17 when it's not. And again, the judge should correct you because the judge should be able to count to 5. Dr. Bohin gave you more important detail. She began by reminding us that baby E was being fed normally up until 2100 hours on August the 3rd. In other words, the time that the mother of baby E and F went down to the unit. Dr. Bohin described baby E as being, quote, incredibly stable, and reminded us that on Dr. Harkness's first examination of baby E, his abdomen was soft, non-tender, non-distended with normal bowel sounds, and thereafter the blood gas results had shown a decline. Yes, but they're simply wrong and miss key signs. This is utterly irrelevant. By no reasonable measure was this a well infant. So Johnson continues. When she was referred to the feeding chart, the one I put up on the screen for you earlier, and the reference to the mucky aspirate, Dr. Bowen said it usually refers to a sort of brownish-green aspirate, so that stomach juices plus any milk that may have been in the stomach, abdomen, may be containing bile and flecks of blood. Altered blood goes brown, I guess that's why it's termed dirty. In the context, then she was asked, in the context of a baby who's been fed twice at 5 and 7 p.m, being fed 2 millilitres, on each occasion there'd been a minimal aspirate, what view do you take of this record that at 9 p.m. before he'd been fed, there was a 16 millilitre aspirate? So this is a disconnect, isn't it, ladies and gentlemen? At 5 and 7, we've got minimal aspirates. 9 p.m, the critical time when the mother of baby E and F is there, a 16 millilitre aspirate. What Dr. Bohin said was, it just struck me as being really odd and out of keeping with what had gone before. Clearly you don't just take the volume of aspirate in isolation, you have to link it to his clinical condition, which had been fine, and he had shown no signs of any gastrointestinal disturbance. He had tolerated those feeds up to that point and had no aspirate at all. So I was just at a loss to explain where this 16 millilitres had come from, despite having had no aspirate before and having had nothing in his tummy for 2 hours. Baby N vomits clear fluid, a child that wasn't being fed at all. Baby G, a projectile vomit round the cot, on the floor, on the chair and on the feed, the full amount of the feed being aspirated. It's all the same thing, isn't it, ladies and gentlemen? So I found it, when I was reading through this, I was finding it very hard to understand this section. What on earth is he going on about? This has absolutely nothing to do with this case whatsoever. And then eventually came to this part of attempting to link things together. There's always this kind of, throughout the closing statement, as I mentioned previously, there's this attempt to link cases together in some sort of inept pattern, using the most obscure aspects of the cases that are of no clinical relevance whatsoever to try to say, oh, it's the same thing, and therefore the only unifying cause can conceivably be Lucy Letby. And of course, that can work on a jury that has no medical understanding, where they're given no other medical witnesses. And obviously it did work. We can see it now for the sheer nonsense that it is. But these are different infants with completely different clinical presentations. They are not in any way similar or linked. The only thing that links them is it's the same crappy hospital that has attempted to treat them. That's it. There's nothing more or nothing less to say about it. These are not isolated freak incidents, Johnson continues. This is a pattern of behaviour, all down to Lucy Letby. This is where you're entitled to go beyond where the experts can go. Not experts, we've already established that. They've told you, haven't they? We look at the cases in isolation. You don't have to do that. You can look at all the evidence. You can make findings of fact as to whether someone's lying or someone's telling the truth. And this is why they're making, and Johnson is making, this chain link, no smoke without fire argument that I discussed with Stephen Phelps recently. They don't want you, the prosecution does not want you to look at the case in isolation. In isolation, it's very obviously a gastrointestinal bleed. It's nothing to do with their embolism. It's nothing to do with all this nonsense he's talking about child N and child G and vomiting. It's a gastrointestinal bleed. The infant lost too much of his blood, and they didn't respond properly. They didn't recognise the danger. They didn't do a blood transfusion. That can be dangerous for anyone of any age, let alone a premature infant. And it all has a part to play in the decision, doesn't it? Johnson continues. Dr. Bohin agreed with Dr. Evans that this was a case of air injected into baby E's circulation together with some kind of injury to cause the bleeding, and she said this: hemorrhage of this magnitude in neonates is vanishingly rare. Vanishingly rare. Babies do sometimes have gastric erosion and ulceration, but it does not result in hemorrhages of this fashion. So she's correct to say it's vanishingly rare, but again, just because something is vanishingly rare does not mean that the explanation is Lucy Letby has engaged in some odd behaviour that can't really be supported by any meaningful evidence. Ultimately, what's being put forward here as a hypothesis is laughable and should really require no further response. But unfortunately, I do have to respond to some of these comments because they were made in court. They could have been critically important in the ultimate verdict. But really what Dr. Bowen's saying here is silly, essentially. For her to make this assertion that they're saying here that the injection into baby E's circulation is significant, but the bleeding is not significant. But if it is significant, then Lucy Letby has caused it. It's just absolute rubbish again. That's the way she put it. Insofar as intravenous air was concerned, Dr. Bohin's view was that the purple patches on the abdomen didn't fit with any explanation other than air embolus, about which he's completely wrong. It was put to Dr. Bohin that in addition to an increased risk of necrotizing enterocolitis, reverse end diastolic flow could put a baby at risk of, quote, other abdominal issues. That was how it was put in cross-examination. She said that not that she knew of, and if any specific issues were to be suggested, then she would be able to answer. Well, no other specific issues were put, ladies and gentlemen. Unfortunately, this is where medical experts could have massively assisted the process. If you have a tag team like Evans and Bohin that are willing to say basically anything, you need that input from actual experts to counter them, and they would have been able to counter them easily in this situation, because what Evans and Bohin put forward was total rubbish. So yet again, we suggest this is an example, as we suggested at the beginning with Lucy Letby's defence statement, make general allegations, look at the specifics. I presume you said do not make general allegations. It's no good saying, well, the care wasn't up to it. Well, you tell us where it came up short and we'll answer. Okay, well, they didn't do a blood transfusion, as an example. If you look at the specifics, the prosecution case is built on absolute sand for this case. It really has no merit whatsoever. Any medic will tell you this. It really just is extremely poor and extremely weak. That's why it's been necessary, as I keep saying, to put this arcane argument together, all these strange strands that are put together to try to make you convinced. And it succeeded. Astonishingly, it succeeded on the jury. Obviously, he had no ability to understand the case. So Nick Johnson continues, Dr. Bohin rejected a suggestion made in cross-examination that stress could have caused excess acid in the stomach, which in turn would have caused the bleeding. So the prosecution position is this, ladies and gentlemen, all child E signs, all the signs of child E, up to and including the start of the night shift on August the 3rd, were normal. So I will say that this is an unlikely claim from the defence. It has absolutely no relevance now. I'm not sure if the prosecution deliberately picked a weak defence argument on purpose, but it is true that it's unlikely that excess stomach acid would have caused these problems, but we know what caused the problems. Johnson continues, he was making good progress, yet within an hour of Lucy Letby taking over at 2000 hours, things had taken a turn for the worse. What are the chances of that? In itself, it doesn't prove, of course, that Lucy Letby sabotaged him. Of course it doesn't. What I'd say about this is we should remember again that we're constantly told that there are no statistics or statistical inferences made in this court case, but they're made all the time. This is yet another example of one. The answer to this allegation here is that this could happen to any nurse at any time. The presence of Lucy Letby here is meaningless, again. So let's continue. But when you look at it in the light of all the other cases where the arrival of Lucy Letby coincides with the unexpected decline of a child, so it's this chain link theory that I keep mentioning, that's all inference from the chart, it's always Lucy's. I've called it in my book, I've described it as the it's always Lucy theory, that's all predicated on that chart that we know has no evidential value, that has no statistical merit whatsoever. So I'll continue. So talking about the arrival of Lucy Letby coinciding with the unexpected decline of a child, we say things go beyond innocent coincidence. Her encounter with the mother of baby E and F gives you more than a big clue of what was really going on. At 2100, baby E was bleeding from his mouth, and when he died 3.5 hours later, he was bleeding profusely. So this is completely discredited and untrue. It just simply doesn't make any sense. When he first collapsed, he was exhibiting an odd skin discoloration that Dr. Harkness had only ever previously seen with baby A. So we now know this is irrelevant. Harkness is wrong about this assertion. This just has no evidential merit. Baby E's final collapse was at a time when Dr. C and Dr. Harkness were discussing what to do and were consulting baby E's records to make their decision. What were the chances of that happening at precisely that moment? Again, this is utterly irrelevant, and frankly, it's a bizarre, unfounded, kind of juvenile line of argument, I would describe it as. So we're now at the highlighted section in the transcript. We're right near the end of the discussion of child E. Again, taken in isolation, it would tell you nothing. But this is the point about circumstantial evidence, isn't it? You don't just look at one strand, you look at the combination. Yeah, so you look at several worthless strands together, which are based on fabrication, misrepresentation, misdirection, and in some cases, outright lying. So I'm going to show you what KC Gudrun Young said about this when speaking on the File on 4 programme on BBC Radio 4. So Gudrun Young said the following: there's a danger in a circumstantial case of adding lots of different things together which in and of themselves are actually quite evidentially weak. You lay them on top of each other and you form a certain conclusion. But in fact, those planks aren't in themselves evidentially sound. You might get 8 pieces of evidence, but if in and of themselves each one of them is really weak, 8 times 0 is 0. It's not 8. Which is an almost perfect description of what we've just seen from Nick Johnson in this passage. And that's where people get very mixed up with circumstantial cases. But it's another area where people's critical reasoning and discernment is often very poor. And that's why, in my view, I've discussed this with Stephen again recently, they've used this strategy of no smoke without fire. We'll just pile the evidence, and eventually they'll think, well, look at, we've been in court for 10 months. There's got to be something to it. We just keep hearing different things. I mean, it reaches a point where, I would love to have the entire transcript and know the word count. I think it must be at least 10 million based on what I've seen. So as I've mentioned, that's 20 times the length of War and Peace, approximately. War and Peace is about 580,000 words. So it's like piling loads of... how can anyone possibly comprehend? And they don't get to read it as well. They have to listen to it. It's what was done in this court case is so unfair, and as Gudrun has pointed out here, it is so utterly flawed. If you want the court case to be fair, it's very clear that Nick Johnson didn't want the court case to be fair. But if you wanted to have an actual fair trial, then this is very dangerous. So we'll just go back for the last couple of paragraphs. So firstly, you look at how these telltale signs run across the cases. That's the power of the evidence. These rapid collapses and deaths always happened when Lucy Letby was in close proximity. So again, referencing the shift chart once more, Lucy Letby was somewhere near the infant at some point, therefore she's obviously attacked the infant, although no one ever sees anything, and we know she's not actually there for some of the collapses. Also, we're going to move the collapses around in court. There are no innocent reasons for baby E's collapse and death, even looking at his case in isolation. Yes, there are, Nick, there are. It's not even a contentious case. The panel didn't even include it in their first report because it's so obvious that the prosecution case is nonsense. So then finally he says, but when you take it with his case and look at their cases with children L and M and the case of baby K and with the others, so he's just throwing anything in now. It's just like he's gone through his cupboards looking for ingredients, he's just chucking them all into a bowl. The responsibility of Lucy Letby for what happened becomes even clearer. So this is just abject chain link nonsense that just has no merit whatsoever, in common with basically everything that he's argued in this section. In conclusion, the best way to describe Nick Johnson, in my estimation, would be a magician or a conjurer, because he creates an illusion before your very eyes, before the eyes of the jury, when nothing has actually happened. And what purports to be a magician has engaged in dishonest acts in front of your very eyes while telling you that it's magic. And actually, there is no magic. Nothing has occurred at all. It's just fraud. It requires this sort of trickery if one is to attempt to pretend that this very obvious gastrointestinal bleed, which was not treated or managed adequately by the hospital, which is very obviously naturally occurring, was not the cause of death for this infant. It is also noticeable how little Nick Johnson talks about air embolism in this case. That's because it has no relevance to the clinical signs of the infant, and it's actually quite laughable that the shyster who we know is responsible for this has put this in the court case. Johnson has to downplay this because it has zero credibility and instead invents some narrative in which Lucy Letby is engaged in some hypothetical and indeterminate act. In order to do this, Johnson is willing to engage in continual and very blatant misrepresentation. He's willing to fabricate all manner of things, and he's even been willing to outright lie. One wonders, indeed, what he wouldn't be willing to do.